If your business uses toxic or hazardous substances, you'll need to train your employees under OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard. But many employers are uncertain when monitoring is required and what other actions are needed to protect employees. OSHA covers a lot of chemicals. If your facility uses any listed substance, your obligations depend on the exposure levels. For each material, OSHA provides an action level and a permissible exposure limit. The action level is based on exposure over an 8-hour period. It must be measured without considering respiratory protection. The permissible exposure limit is exactly what the term implies. You must ensure that no workers are exposed above that level. OSHA also lists a short-term exposure limit for many chemicals, which is a maximum exposure during a short period, such as 15 minutes. First, you'll need to measure exposure levels. If you can document that exposure is below the action level, you should not need to take further action. However, if something like a new process could increase exposures, then you must monitor the levels again. If exposures are above the action level, but below the permissible exposure limit, you'll need to repeat the monitoring every 6 months. Also, medical surveillance of exposed workers might be required. The regulations provide the details. If worker exposure exceeds a permissible exposure limit, and engineering or other controls can't reduce exposure, then respiratory protection is likely required. Some regulations also describe required actions if there's an emergency, like exposure from equipment failure. Usually, this involves medical surveillance. In addition, you may need to take action if an employee shows signs and symptoms of possible overexposure. Even for exposures below the action level, an employee could get sensitized and have symptoms. Since employers use tens of thousands of different chemicals, OSHA can't list them all. Employers using non-listed materials should check other sources for information on exposure limits, like the NIOSH Pocket Guide to Hazardous Chemicals. The NIOSH Guide provides recommended exposure limits, and OSHA considers those values when creating regulations. However, OSHA generally won't enforce those limits. As with any other hazard, engineering and work practice controls offer the best protection. If those methods cannot reduce exposures below the action level, then regular monitoring and medical surveillance may be required. And if exposures are above a short-term or permissible exposure limit, then protective equipment like respirators may be necessary.